Let's call this meeting to order. This is a study session of the Prescott City Council. Today's Tuesday, April 24th, 2018. Let's go ahead and take roll, please.
Mayor Mingarelli. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Orr.
Here.
Councilman Blair.
Yes.
Councilman Good.
Here.
Councilman Lamerson.
Here.
Councilwoman Scholl.
Here.
Councilman Sischka.
Here.
All are present.
All right, we have one item on the study session, which is a discussion regarding amending the city charter. If you're interested in public comment, we do have comment cards available for that after the presentation.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. You can limit me to 3 minutes. I'll be happy to sit down and let Maureen take over. But I don't think I'll have that locked. So today we're going to go through some, again, emphasize possible charter amendments. Kind of a bit of history, going back to the last election, there was a little bit of confusion about how the city counts votes / ballots for purposes of our local elections. So there's been some discussion about changing that to make it clearer and more precise. And that obviously would require a charter amendment. And to remind, I think everybody knows that the process would be we would have this study session today. Perhaps get some direction, perhaps not. And then it would come to a vote of the council where you would then forward by resolution to the voters suggested or possible charter amendments. And then obviously the voters would have to approve those. And subsequent to that, the governor would have to then sign the revised charter, at which point those charter changes would become effective. But again, so going back, we had this discussion about changing the charter for in the way we count votes or ballots in the local election. So as a staff, we decided, let's bring forward some potential cleanup items because, again, going to an election, there were a number of things in the charter that just don't apply anymore, or somewhat archaic, or some other suggested simplifications of things, and we'll go through those kind of at a one-by-one basis. Now, in your packet, you have from the clerk a number of pages of suggested or potential charter changes. This slide deck is somewhat revised from that and updated based on some subsequent conversations we've had. So it may differ slightly from what you have in the packet, but so this is the most current version of what we're here to discuss. So the last time charter was amended in November 2011. So these are some possible updates. Obviously, this list may not be complete. You may have some ideas. The public may have some ideas of other possible updates to the charter. First, question and some of these are staff suggested, some of these staff takes no position. First,
when do we get a chance to ask you a question?
As I'm going, it'd probably be easier.
Okay, I'll ask it now.
All right.
I have a question on how, and I didn't see it on here, how the council and the mayor have to generate votes to be put on the ballot, where that language came from. In other words, if I pull out a packet, I'm required to generate X amount of signatures to be put on the ballot.
That's
state law, or
yes.
is it?
That is state law.
So, to follow up on that, because they make so much money, Yavapai County supervisors, when they run, their percentages for what they have to collect for signatures is like 75 signatures opposed to us, and I'm just using a fictitious number, 750. Where is there the difference in the breakdown of how many signatures each office has to collect?
It's a percentage of voters who voted in the last election where a mayor was elected, which in our case is every 2 years. So we take that number and it's 10%?
5% minimum, maximum 10.
So between 5 and 10%. So in the county supervisor races, it's in the district from which they come. So if out of 5 districts, there may be one, and they're supposed to be roughly proportionate in size to each other. But if certain districts have a low voter turnout, the number to get on the ballot, the number of signatures, valid signatures, it would be less than, say, a different district. Here, it's based on the number of voters who vote in the city elections, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but our turnout's about 60%. So we have a fairly significant threshold that you have to get on a ballot because of the great voter turnout we have. We have a significant, we're probably as strong as any other city in the state in terms of voter turnout.
Okay. That's
And one of the reasons, by the way, is we have an all mail-in ballot election. So every registered voter in the city gets a ballot, simply fill it out, postage paid, mail it in. That's probably one of the factors. So the first item.
I'm sorry,
yes.
Councilman Lamerson has
Okay.
a comment.
Far be it from me ever to interrupt the esteemed attorney. Go ahead, John. All right. Yeah, wet your whistle because you keep talking.
Oh, I'm happy to answer your questions, but
I don't have a question per se, other than, having been here for a while, I was here through a number of charter changes that we presented to the public, recommendations, suggestions, etc. I found it interesting, your comments as staff-driven, and the word archaic comes to mind. Hopefully, it's the staff's not trying to figure out what's archaic. I mean, I kind of found that an interesting word.
well, my point is that some of the, and you'll see some of the provisions in the charter aren't really applicable anymore because of changes in state law or the Constitution.
That's different.
Some procedures and processes for adopting things aren't really done anymore, and we'll get to that. Ordinances versus resolutions, and there's some other reasons. So these are both either suggested or options to really update the charter to deal with things that are in existence today. For instance, we'll get to it. One of the requirements is that ordinances be published in a book to be held in, and maintained by the city clerk. Well, one of the suggested changes is that they're posted on the city's website. Again, archaic may not be the right word, but
Thank you,
try to
but
keep up with the
that's
times.
under the presumption that 100% of the people that we actually serve understand what it means to have a website. Not everybody does. So I would hate to think we were going down to the path of denying equal opportunity for everybody in the city, especially considering our demographic that may or may not have access to a website.
And understood, and along those lines, when we're moving towards what is known as e-government, to try and be paperless or use less paper, there's always the fallback option of getting a hard copy of some document. The clerk maintains those electronically generally and prints it out. Same with public records request. It is an e-process for the most part for public records, but there's always the option for somebody to come in and manually fill out a form over the counter and get a hard copy. So what we're talking about, though, in terms of charter changes, and this is the initial discussion. So we're even though it may be staff suggested change, there's a whole process that would have to go through before it would actually take effect.
I appreciate your explanation, and I appreciate the comments staff suggested change.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the first slide, is not a staff suggested. This is something that has been discussed, really for council to make a determination on. If passed, it would change the mayor term from every 2 year to 4 years. About a little over half the cities have 4-year terms. Half
What
the
if
cities
we
have
don't
2 years.
agree with that? One of the things that the people of Prescott have the opportunity to do is change the quorum every 2 years.
Again,
That was the point of having certain things built into the charter. In whether it's the mayor or a floating council, whatever the case would be, the citizens have a right to say whether they're happy or not.
yeah, and that's what this is about. This would go through a process where it would be discussed today. The council will then, by a majority vote, have to agree to send this to the voters, at least 4 votes by resolution, at which point the voters would get to decide. So it's for discussion purposes only. And we put this up for discussion. We're not making a recommendation whether it should be 2 or 4 years, but we felt that this has been brought up in the past. So we wanted to put it out there for you all to discuss.
Okay, since we're discussing it here again, by way of quorum discussion, by way of setting the agenda discussion, it's a mayoral's role to set the agenda. And that's generally what we discuss up here, is what the mayor has decided to put on an agenda. And that's one of the reasons why, in my humbled opinion, we kept the mayor at every 2 years. The public in the city of Prescott has the opportunity to say, we like the guy, he's doing a good job, blah, 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 rather than changing council people every 2 years.
And I guess my suggestion is that's a discussion amongst you seven, that if this is something today or some point in the future, if this is something that the council wants to put out to the voters, then by all rights you can do that by a vote on a resolution at some point in the future. So you let me know if you want me to move on to the next slide, or if you all want to discuss this amongst yourselves.
Councilman Blair, you've got.
Well, I guess institutional knowledge is depending on how you look at it, but this has been talked about. This is the third time, just so you know. And the city of Prescott used to have 3 2-year terms for council and then 3 4-year terms. Then it was decided that we need to keep the people on here without the same ones going on for continuity. So we did it on offset years, so you have it every 2 years. And then it was talked about 2011 when Tammy Lynn was a councilwoman, and this same issue came up about the mayor 2 years or 4 years. You can think about whatever you want, but we had a mayor at one time that thought it was time for a change, and his direction for this community was not a good direction, in my opinion. If he would have had a 4-year term, it would have been a miserable nightmare for 4 years for this community. That's why it didn't go to a 4-year term the last time we talked about it. And again, just like Lamerson said, if you like the guy in the chair, then he gets voted back in. Marlon had 3 years, Rolly, 3 terms. And there's a reason for that. And I'd hate to think that we'd have to sit here and suffer through a nightmare for 4. So that's the way it was, and I'm just sharing that with the council. And that's why at that time in 2011, we opted not to change from 2 to 4 because we saw the backside of it. So that was just my opinion for some.
It's good perspective. Councilman Sischka?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's my perspective, too. People have come up and they've said, well, isn't it kind of goofy that the mayor only gets 2 years? And I've always said to them, well, you know, if we ended up with a mayor where we found out he couldn't tie his own shoes, then that's probably a good situation. And no, present company accepted.
I wear boots,
Yeah.
Steve, so.
But on the other hand, it takes a couple years to learn the language. And so that's the other side of this whole situation. And so, you know, I'd be interested to hear the rest of the conversation and viewpoints of the council. You know, I appreciate what Councilman Lamerson says, what Councilman Blair just said. You know, I think that there are disadvantages and advantages to both.
Difficult for me to discuss, obviously, but having run, I would say, you know, you're raising a bunch of money for a 2-year term, and it is a lot of effort. I wonder if you discourage some folks from running for mayor because it is a 2-year term versus a 4. But I totally get what Councilman Blair is saying. I think he makes some good points, and it's good historical perspective. Councilman Good?
Well, I have a tendency to agree with that. I think as far as the cost of running campaigns every 2 years, if you're doing a good job, theoretically you shouldn't have to spend as much because you're running on a record at that point, and the community is in support of the direction that the mayor is sending the community and speaking as the community's a leader. And on the flip side, if it's turning out that the community was misled in their expectations of the mayor and they want to make a change, then being able to have that opportunity in 2 years rather than 4 makes a lot of sense.
Councilwoman Scholl, excuse me.
That's all right. This is an interesting discussion because I really do see both sides of it. There are perks to having a 2-year term, as previously mentioned, but it seems like a lot of times the mayor just gets going and then he's back up for re-election. But on the other side, elections are not only expensive, it's taxing on the community. I know in this last election, a lot of people were tired of it. It was a 9-month process. I have a question for Mr. Palladini. Is it common for communities to change the terms of the mayor?
Well, I don't, Councilwoman and Mayor, Council, I don't know. I can address that in terms of how common it is for a charter change to do that, but the data we have shows that a little over half the cities have 4-year mayor terms, and 49 versus 42, whatever percentage that works out to be, and 42 have 2-year terms. Now, I would note that of the 2-year terms, and I don't have a specific number, but a number of towns in particular and some cities, the council appoints the mayor. Or votes for the mayor, and so those are usually a 2-year term. So some of that 42 would be a council elected or council nominated mayor position, for a year or two, or a year, I guess, or 2 years, I'm sorry. So, and obviously not all of the 49 cities and towns are charter cities. I think we have, let's say 10 charter cities in the state? Okay. So,
No, there's probably more than that, I'm
yeah,
sorry.
I think there's 17 or 18.
There's 17.
Yeah, so which means that the mayor term is set in the non-charter is set by ordinance. So that would be a vote of the mayor and council, not, or by initiative, but we don't have that data. Again, this is really for your discussion, and we're, along those lines, just to make it clear that this can be and probably should be more than one discussion. So if you have information requests to bring back, let us know, and we can certainly have another workshop study session on this, on one or more of these topics. This is sort of an introduction to charter amendments for this year.
Councilman Lamerson.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciated your comment earlier, and I appreciated Mr. Good's comment earlier, and I appreciated Lex's comment with regards to money. It's not about the money. If the public thinks you're doing a good job, they come forward. It's not about the money. I've sat with, I think, 8 different makeups on council. And the fact of the matter still remains that if the public wants you here, you will be here. Because that's what the public wants, all right? And with respect to, it's difficult to go out and generate money and get people to work on this, that, and it's not if you're doing what the public wants you to do. If you're a beloved mayor, whether it was Marlon, whether it's Rowley, whether it's you, whatever the case would be, you will be here again. That's the way it works, because that's what the public wants. And I just think it would be disrespectful to the public not to give them the opportunity to change the majority and the direction of the council on a regular basis. It's called a vote of confidence. And if they have the right to change the vote of confidence, if they don't like what you're doing, you'll be unelected. We've seen that happen too.
Councilman Good.
I was just thinking there's another aspect to this. As we continue to grow as a city, and some of our requirements for growth when it comes to capital projects and other things like this, they're not simple projects that can be initiated and completed over a 2-year period of time. Sometimes they may take much longer. And we would end up, and I think we have in the past, with projects that ended up starting and stopping and restarting. So having a little longer term would allow a mayor who is running on a platform of particular project completion, they'd give them the chance to get them completed so that the public would be able to see whether those promises and commitments were kept, as opposed to something that got started and the public doesn't understand sometimes the complexities of the regulations involved, and then say, well, it didn't get done, so we got to throw the bum out and bring somebody new in, and then we really waste a lot of taxpayer dollars in the process.
Councilwoman Scholl.
Mr. Palladini, so let's say hypothetically as a council we voted to move this particular issue to the ballot. Does that mean as a council we are taking a stand that we support this, or we're just giving the opportunity to the voters to make a decision?
The latter. Okay. I think you can, I think you can vote to refer something to the voters for the voters' decision and yet take a position contrary to or against the change. I think, Councilman Lamerson, a lot of good points up here. Councilman Lamerson makes, I think, a very good point that in theory, with a 2-year election of mayor, the voters have the opportunity to literally change the majority, change 4 seats. I'm not sure how often that happens, but that is, and that may be the rationale behind this. This was, if you can see, it was initially adopted in 1969, and it's been presumably in effect ever since. So it's really, again, a question for you all whether it doesn't, and obviously it's not made today. Is this something that you want the voters to decide? No. Do the voters want to decide? And maybe that's part of the process too.
Sure. Mayor Pro Tem, we've all aired this out pretty good here. Do you have any thoughts you want to add?
Mayor,
Yeah.
this is Billy. Can I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't have a button to push to tell you I want to talk. Sorry. No, I believe what Steve Blair has said as far as, if you have a nightmare of a mayor, but again, then the voters could vote that person out. However, the continuity, and I think Councilman Good brings that up, the continuity, I remember in speaking with business people, they question why, we put a mayor in and they're only in for 2 years, because the mayor does set the agenda and kind of the tone. And so as a business person, you want to be assured that the city that's moving in this direction is going to stay in that direction. So I think the continuity would be one of the positive reasons. However, I do understand what Councilman Blair and Councilman Siska and Lamerson are saying too. So, I just do think the continuity would be a plus.
Question, is there a righteous reason why it's 2 or 4 years? Could there be a medium of saying a 3-year term?
Could be 3.
We can be different, can't we?
The challenge with 3 is you'd always have an off-year election, and the cost of running, or electing one office is the same as running 4 or electing 4. It's because of the mail-in type ballots, and it would be on an even-numbered year. Not to go down the path too far, but it would be in an even-numbered year. If it's in the fall, it would fall under the statewide elections, but you'd have to piggyback onto the non-mail-in ballots. And we're going to get to that discussion in a little bit.
Sorry I asked the question.
I know. You should be.
At this rate, with the number of slides you have, we're going to be out here about 7 o'clock tonight.
I probably should have put this, probably should have put this one last, but we're doing it in order of the charter. So happy to move on. Trust me, happy to move on. A lot of the rest of it should be hopefully fairly straightforward, but let's move on to the next slide. This one, again, should be rather, maybe not, should be rather simple. It's just simply a name change. Mayor Pro Tem really means temporary. Vice Mayor is sort of the second in charge if the mayor can't be here or fulfill duties. So statistically, Maureen, the clerk's office, surveyed 33 cities, 32 of which use the term vice mayor. The role of the mayor pro tem is probably more appropriately called vice mayor. Again, something for y'all to, and this is really a cleanup, shouldn't be too controversial one way or the other. Something to consider.
Well, isn't the role of mayor or mayor pro tem the selection of the large council selecting that person?
That doesn't change, just the name.
So who cares?
Yeah.
Okay.
Again, so
I mean, I don't necessarily need to be like Prescott Valley. They have a mayor or vice mayor. It's kind of different to hear a different name. I mean, same way with Dewey, Humboldt, or wherever.
we're putting it out there for
Okay,
you.
just a question.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
All right. All right. Going once? All right. This is, maybe we're going to take a while. This is a discussion about stipends. Now, as you can see, the current stipends are $500 and $750 respectively. And this was done in 1999. So and again, it's very simple math, and I'm not a statistician. The 500 and 750 are equivalent in today's dollars to about 750 and 1050, if you sort of take into account inflation. And that's,
I was going to say that kind of begs the point. If you decided to look at this, you could tie it to an inflationary adjustment.
Or just, again, you're sending to the voters if you choose to put it to the voters, you're going to have to come up with a number.
Or a percentage, I guess, or.
Yeah.
You hit the really good ones here right up front. Councilman,
Blame the clerk's office on this. They put them in order.
Councilman Blair.
Well, I would like to make ton, but that's not why you're here doing this job. And, you know, frankly, when you ask people out there and they'll put the question to you, why are you doing it for so little, especially if you work for a living? So what you're doing is you're stopping your whole day, your whole work life, and you're coming in maybe all day Tuesday or however many hours. In my case, sometimes I'm here 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning because there's nobody here. I can get my stuff done and get out of here. The question is, you do it for the love of the community. However, there's an inherent cost that goes with that. And maybe we could get more candidates to run for council if we made it a legitimate cost factor. Because as the last 3 elections, we've had, I think, 5, 6 that have run for 3 seats for council. There's not the opportunity to get a very good selection. Look at me, I'm still sitting here. So my point is I would like to see it tied to an index so that it's not revisited all the time, but I think it should be raised because I think you will get, you know, more qualified people. Or maybe you give me a retirement after so many years.
Mr. Mayor, have we done any surveys of other cities in Arizona of similar size?
I don't know, you guys, have we done anything?
Arizona League has a really good website, so we might be able to, or a spreadsheet that they've collected all that information, so it may be on there that we could share with you.
Yeah, I just want to say, and I'm not going to pick on you, but I am. We have a new mayor, and the new mayor, when he was running, said, I'm not necessarily going to be a full-time mayor. But I think Greg, and I'm not going to put words in his mouth, has found out to be a good mayor, that you're here a whole lot more than you ever thought you were going to be here. And when you have somebody that works for a living like this mayor does, and it's distracting from his own personal life to run this community, distracting from his own personal business to run this community, I think the compensation should be a little higher.
Councilman Lamerson.
Wow. I'd sure like a lot more money. I don't know where to draw the line. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, it costs me about $150, $200 a day out of my pocket to come down here. But like Blair said, I do that not necessarily because of the money. That isn't why we do this. We do this to serve a community that's very good to each one of us in its way. It's not about the money. We get compensation. People know who we are. People know what we do. They know how much time we spend here, whether it's putting in blinds or whether it's selling jewelry, whether it's selling dog food. They know who we are. All right?
I'm still
Alexa,
waiting.
I didn't mean to leave you out, whether it's going to school or not.
I'm still waiting for that envelope to slide through my window on my truck.
Yeah, we all get accused of that, and we all know that none of that's true. We take a bad deal. I think what's fair is fair, and here again, the community will judge what's fair. I don't think that $500 a month or $750 a month or anything else is the issue. I think is, you know, we all know what our threshold can bear. And if we didn't want to do it, we wouldn't do it. It's just love of community. That's why we're here.
Mayor, could I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with Lemerson on this. You know, we are, $500 a month, I think probably even barely covers the expenses that it even does. But that's not the reason we're here. We're a city right now that's $86 million in debt on our pension. And I think we just need to stay totally focused on getting that debt paid down. And certainly, a couple $100 here or there is not going to make a difference, but I think it sends a message. And so I personally would rather that not be in this discussion, raising the salaries.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Mayor Pro Tem. Councilman Shishka.
Thank you, Mayor. You know, to be honest with you guys, I'd do it for free. You know that I've heard Blair say that he ends up giving it away anyway. So do I. So do probably everybody. Give it away. And so, it's what we're doing for the community, and that's what's important. And whatever happens to come along with that, but I'm perfectly satisfied to give away $500.
I think it's important that that's the right statement as far as I'm concerned. And would we all like to have more? Probably so. But at the end of the day, you're going to give it back somehow or another. And I think as long as I've been here and as long as Lamberson's been here, I think that as strapped as this community's become with education financing and all the 443 financing and all the things we go out to the public to ask for, this would be the last one I would want to go to the public to ask for as a raise for myself.
It is called public service, emphasis on service. So, Councilwoman Scholl.
I think it's a hard ask to go to the public and ask for a raise when we just made an incredibly hard ask for 443. And this is, I don't think this is something worth pursuing at this point.
Yep.
Check mark on that one.
Councilman Lamerson.
Thank you. Couldn't have said it any better, Alexi. You did a good job. You must have good stewardship here. Fact of the matter is, we made a commitment to the public. We were going to pay off our indebtedness to PSPRS as quick as we could. This is a slap in the face to raise salaries of the council.
Councilman Good.
And I would echo that as well. I mean, let's keep in mind these are public tax dollars. And even though I contribute probably my entire monthly stipend to organizational membership and donations, et cetera, raising that would just mean I'd be giving back more. So taking it from the taxpayers and turning around and giving it to a different organization of my choice, I just prefer having the taxpayers keep it in their pocket and let them decide how they want to make contributions to what organizations in the community.
I think you've got a little consensus on that.
Crystal. So this is the next section. This is the different, the change that we're suggesting. Again, this isn't the exclusive way of getting records, but this is now the way that we maintain records is on our city website. So this would be a change that we would recommend to keep up with technology because most of our records maintenance is now electronic.
Comments?
This is a change that, again, is one of those things that we don't do. In my recollection, we don't do, and frankly, it's probably more administrative than it is policy. I don't know, frankly, why this was put in, but this suggested strike through. Really, it would be taking out something that is more administrative, is done in budgets and done for city code, for instance, and probably shouldn't be in the charter. Again, it's a
John.
Yes,
John,
ma'am.
this is Billy. Could I ask you to talk about which article? And
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the title. It's what's now slide 7, which is titled page 13, section 1, administrative departments and offices.
Thank you.
If I could just add to that, part of the budget process, we always do bring council a roster to adopt. So you do see the employees, you do see the titles. This is just so specific when you get to actual duties and everything. It's really more of council approving all the job descriptions out there, which is more administrative.
Councilman Good.
Yeah, I just see this as more responsibility of the city manager, not council being involved in this.
And that's sort of our thinking as well.
Fair enough.
All right. Next is slide 8, page 15, Article 5, Section 1, appointed boards and commissions. The two suggested changes here are to the council, and this is our practice, and it's actually in the city code that the council creates boards and commissions by resolution. For some reason, the charter and the code are inconsistent. This is creating a board or commission is more appropriately done by resolution than ordinance, and that's why the suggested change. The second part of the strike through is, again, this is a somewhat of a throwback, I suppose. The way this city works is that every board and commission has at least one liaison, who I guess is technically an ex officio member. So this says that the mayor and city manager are, and that's just simply not the practice, and it's really not done. So this sort of brings the charter consistent with practices that we do currently.
Okay.
Okay, slide 9, Article 6, Finance and Taxation, page 17. And I'll throw this to Mark, but this was a 1969 amendment, which is inconsistent with state law and the Constitution, and it's not really what we do. And I'll just turn the rest over to Mark for further explanation.
Well, and again, we brought this forward to take out just because it is a duplication of what's in state law and state constitution. It's a very vague statement, really. The details of how property tax levies are levied is in state law, Title 42 or Section 42. And the state constitution, of course, has a property tax levy. So we're just proposing to get this out of the charter.
Okay, any comments on that?
No, I'd support that.
Okay.
Slide 10, page 18, section 10, transfer appropriations. So wording change, appropriations, I think, is the more accurate term.
Yeah, it's definitely was just, I guess, a typo back in '93. Sorry I made it then. But we transfer appropriation. We do not transfer funds. It's just budget spending authority. So I'm not sure why the word funds was used. It was several years ago.
Okay.
Slide 11, page 19, section 14, transfer of sums from any funds to interest funds.
And this, again, was brought forward. This is more old, the way we used to issue bonds, used to have sinking funds and interest funds. You know, the need for sinking funds, reserve funds, or any of those funds are part of a debt issue, and they're kind of outlined in the debt issue. And to have reference to interest funds in the charter, they're not really used anymore in debt issues over the last, 20, 30 years. They were quite common back in the 70s, but we quit using them in the 90s. So it's just, again, to get rid of it. Any bond requirement is outlined in the bond itself, so it doesn't really belong in the charter.
Okay.
Independent audit, slide 12, page 19, section 15.
And this deals with our annual independent audit. We're required to have one by our charter and also by state law. The charter requirement actually requires us to change every 3 years, and the auditor who is in place cannot bid again on the immediate next term. The problem or the issue here is 3 years is a short time in an audit. The first 2 years, you're basically getting permanent files together. You're getting all the stuff with the auditor. You're teaching the systems. By the third year, they're actually able to look at a few things to try to improve some of the systems in there, and then we're done, and we got to start all over. By making it a 5-year term, we'll have a little more consistency, be able to have a little better audit, and probably be able to bring down our audit fees a little bit, because they have to spend a lot more time the first 2 years in an audit. So we think it's an overall good thing. You look at other communities never change auditors, which of course I don't think is a good idea. I just think we need to look at a longer term from 3 to 5.
Councilman Good?
What are the generally accepted accounting procedures for this?
There is no generally accepted accounting procedure or accounting law related to the number of years an auditor can continue to perform an independent audit. There, of course, is a lot of rules and procedures about what is independence and how do you maintain independence, but there is no set term. 5 years is still very short when you look at other communities out there and what they're doing.
Well, have we looked at other communities to find out?
Yeah, a lot of them don't have the requirement. Prescott Valley, of course, doesn't have a charter, so they don't have the requirement. They use the same auditor for 5 to 10 years at a time. Again, we're looking just to move from 3 to 5 and leave the requirement to change audit firms in there. Just trying
I'm
to get
sure the
to
concern is potentially having a new auditor come in and uncover some inappropriate accounting practices and be able to correct those before they become particularly egregious. Not that it's ever happened here, but it does happen.
And again,
Could go with 4?
well, council can do whatever they want, including leaving it at 3. The issue is an auditor coming in is probably less likely to uncover something than an auditor who is able to spend more time and in the subsequent years from the initial years. With the changing with the standards in place for auditors on how audits are done and the procedures that need to be documented and that type of stuff, it's different than it used to be, I guess we'll say, used to be being 40 years ago. There are standards they have to follow. The odds of an auditor coming in and finding something the previous auditor didn't find are very slim.
Okay.
Slide 13, this is page 24, Article 7, and this deals with what we currently require approvals by ordinance. We're suggesting or recommending that the strike-throughs, both in slides 13 and 14, be removed from the requirement to adopt an ordinance. The main reason for this is efficiency and cost. Our charter requires us to publish all ordinances, and as you know, we accept easements for sewer lines or grant easements to AP&S for power, and all of those ordinances have to be published at a print, and then there's a cost to that. It's not necessary to do it by ordinance. We could do it by resolution. So we're recommending that these items be removed from the charter as requiring ordinances. We would still obviously, council would still have to take those actions, but it could be done by resolution. There's also some confusion about ordinances taking effect in 30 days. That rule only applies, or that law only applies to legislative ordinances when you're adopting a city code amendment or amending zoning and things like that, or annexations. So again, somewhat of a cleanup, I think.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, going to slide 15. This is motions to reconsider. We just don't do that. It's inconsistent with open meeting law. An item can always be brought back on a subsequent agenda by either the mayor or two members of the council putting it on the agenda. So that's really the better process of doing what could be considered a motion to reconsider. Again, we have currently and probably into the future, we have meetings every 2 weeks. To try and sort of shoehorn something in a 24-hour or 24 to 36 hours, as this suggests, is difficult with open meeting law requirements. So that's the suggested Section 8 strike through. On 9, or new Section 8, or whatever we want to call it, this is just adding something that we do, and that's required by state laws, that all ordinances and resolutions, in addition to be signed by the mayor, tested by the clerk, or approved as to form by the city attorney. So that's, again, just sort of a cleanup item. This is consistent with the prior discussion. The title says ordinances and resolutions, but the body says ordinances, so we're just striking through the title. Because again, we do a lot of things by resolution, and we certainly don't want to publish those because they can add up to a substantial cost. Next slide, 17. This goes back to the ordinances and resolutions. This is, again, I don't mean to use a term that may be offensive as archaic, but this is not the way we do it, and not the way we should be doing it. When we keep everything pretty much electronically rather than in physical books. Bidding, this is something that we want to take out of the city charter, primarily because it's addressed in the city code, and it's really something that's more appropriately done as code rather than charter, because there needs to be some fluidity in changing the way we do public bidding.
Yeah, that's basically it. And we're also doing a workshop next council meeting on the 8th, whatever day the next council meeting is. We have a workshop on procurement code changes. We're trying to get that revised, and that's where this should be, and that's why we're proposing to have it struck out of the city charter.
Okay, slide 19. This deal, again, this is consistent with our prior discussion. Leases should be done by resolution, consistent with any other real estate transaction, rather than ordinance. It's cleaner, doesn't require publication. It doesn't require publication of the ordinance. The notice and all that still remain. The notice of the intent to lease still remains prior to entering into any lease. Slide 20, sale of city property. This is the one that we probably should have a little discussion on. Couple of options here would be, well, as you can see, there's a couple of weird strike-throughs. So right now, the charter for personal property, which is anything not real estate that the city sells, anything above 3,000 has to have council approval. It is, I guess, at best difficult to sell personal property, always requiring council approval, especially in a auction bidding type process. And I'll defer to Mark on that. So one of the suggestions is just to strike that out, or change it to say that personal property will be sold as provided in the city code, which again is part of the procurement code discussion. And I'll turn over to Mark for further discussion on that.
Where this has caused a problem, which is why we brought it forward, obviously real estate's different from personal property. In personal property, a city our size doing all the functions we do, we end up selling several things that can amount to a lot of money. For instance, scrap from our water service. You know, we accumulate scrap, old meters, old things like that. We sell it. You know, the city charter requires we publish it for bids, and if it's over $3,000, we got to get council approval. You know, the best way to sell scrap is really to find a scrap dealer that's willing to pay a higher price because you have a lot of it or whatever. That doesn't really allow us to do that very easily with the city code changes. Selling personal property seems to be more of an administrative function. It's kind of what the city manager, council through the city code could dictate how that would be done, whether through city manager approval. Obviously, vehicles, we bring a list to council right now. They go to auction. If we were ever to explore another way of selling vehicles where we do it through a dealer network or something, you know, that's going to even be a little harder to know what they're going to sell for. Again, just a proposal. We can continue to deal with the challenges this brings if council doesn't want to consider.
That just seems to be almost inflation adjusted. At a certain point, we have to have faith in our city manager to be able to manage the city without micromanaging. So that seems like a reasonable number to me.
And you can set, if this is changed to in the manner provided by the city code, certainly council then has the ability to adjust the number by way of an ordinance rather than have to go back to the voter. So this is somewhat more frozen or set in stone than a rather simple city code amendment.
Councilman Lamerson.
Thank you, Mayor. Laura, I think you were the only one on the council at the time. I remember a time frame in history when somebody wanted to sell some of our Parks and Recs equipment, and we're going to sell it to themselves because they could. And there was a reason why we put certain things into the charter to ensure that the stewards of the taxpayers' money, which is also equipment, had some oversight as to what was being done. You remember what I'm talking about?
Kayaks.
Hey, there you go. And it was all for personal use. There were reasons for certain things to be done and council to have oversight as to how the taxpayers' money was being distributed amongst themselves. I mean, it's kind of like a den of thieves sometimes.
Understood. And I would sort of pose to you that council can give itself oversight probably better by city code because it allows for some flexibility as to the number rather than, if the number's fixed in the charter, anytime you want to adjust for inflation, as you can see, this was adopted in '99. So whatever those dollars are worth now, it's still currently $3,000. So that's kind of the discussion I think to have about, and this is strictly personal property, and you know, any sort of, by the way, self-dealing conflict of interest would violate many other things in the charter, including conflicts of interest law and theft and fraud and those kinds of things. So
I agree with you, John, I truly do, but remember that our oversight's only on 3 employees. Okay, so I'm just sharing with you, we've been down this path, and on behalf of the public, there were reasons why we implemented certain things within the charter, and one of them was to ensure council oversight on all of this type of thing. So sometimes, you know, it all gets lost in the shuffle, and it's really not that important. Well, it is important because it adds up.
the next item on this slide deals with the sale of real estate. Currently, our only way to sell real estate is to list it or publish the sale for 3 weeks and then open bids. It's not, and as you recall, recently the city sold a number of pieces of city real estate that were deemed surplus. That may or may not be the best way to sell real estate. So what we're discussing here is providing a couple of options. One is option one would be our current process. Option two would be listing the property with the real estate broker in a sort of typical commercial real estate fashion and selling it, through that process. And then the third would be in some other manner determined by council to be in the best interests of the city. That would take that's kind of a catch-all that would allow council to enter into a real estate sale, for instance, for economic development purposes. If you had a potential buyer of city property who wanted to buy a piece of property and do some particular economic development type development, we could not go out and just sell it to that potential developer, that economic development opportunity. Under the charter, we would just have to put it out to a 3-week publishing and then get bids. And sometimes those types of transactions are way more complex than what this charter provision provides for. So again, it's not striking the current process, it's just adding to that to provide some options to ultimately to the council. Which, by the way, any of those three, if that were ever adopted, all those three would still have to go through a public process and be adopted by or approved by council at a public meeting. So it would still be all in the open, pursuant to open meeting law. Okay. Slide 21. Now we're getting to really the reason sort of why we were here or why we're here. As you recall from the last election, our current charter talks about the being elected by getting a majority of the ballots cast. That tends to be somewhat complicated and confusing, and it also doesn't take into account what are called undervotes or overvotes. Overvotes are if there are 3 council races and somebody votes for 4 people, that's a ballot cast. If there are 3 council seats open and somebody votes for 1 or 2, it's called an undervote. It's still a ballot cast. So what the proposed language, the proposed change is to go to really this is consistent with state statute, by the way, and with probably almost most every other city and town in the state. All cities and towns are required to do it this way, except charter cities. Most charter cities have adopted this type of language in terms of counting votes. So how this works is in a normal election year, you have 3 council seats open. You take the total number of votes. So if there are undervotes, that may be 1 or 2 on a ballot. You total them up, you divide by 3, and then 50% plus 1 is a winner. So you're not giving credit to someone who votes for 1 candidate for council on a ballot. That really counts as effectively 3 votes potentially in terms of trying to get a majority of council members, or trying to get a majority of if you want to. Trying to elect someone. So this is a process that's more consistent. It's consistent with state law and more consistent with every non-charter city and town in the state, and probably over half of the charter cities in the state. So this is the more typical way of doing it. Did that math make sense?
Yes.
Okay. The next part of this is that if, and this, by the way, would work in a mayor election too, but the math is very simple. If you get 50% plus one of the vote, you win. There's no dividing or anything like that. The next part is an option, a suggestion, and that is that if there are primarily if dealing with council elections, assuming there are 3 seats open, if there are only 6 candidates for those 3 seats who file the proper number of signatures, then the primary is deemed the general, and the 3 top vote getters win. If you do the math, it should work out to be the same by taking the times 3 or dividing by 3 and then 50% plus 1, except for overvotes and things like that. So if there are 3 council seats open and 6 candidates run, then the primary is deemed the general, and the 3 top vote getters would be elected under this language. Same with the mayor's race. If there are 2 mayoral candidates, I guess mathematically it's possible that if there are 2 mayor candidates, neither gets 50% for some reason. I guess it's mathematically possible. This would deem the top vote getter the winner. So it would be sort of another opportunity to dispense with a second runoff type election.
Yeah, John, I have a question on that.
Sure.
You gave us a history of past elections.
We do. Is that on this slide deck?
We'd have to put it on Elmo.
Oh.
Give us a history of past elections, and I did notice that in 2 of those elections, a person who actually won in the primary lost in the general.
Yes. In fact, when Councilman Lizelle was elected, he was 5th. His competitor was 4th, and they traded places in the general. So, but that was a runoff type election. So, and I don't know, it's hard to know if that would change. So in this case, these are the total number of votes cast. And if you could do the math very quickly in your head, if you took it, let's say you take 2013 and the council members, you add all those votes up, you divide by 3 seats, or by 3, and then if the candidate gets 50% plus 1, that candidate would have been elected. I don't know if that would have elected, I mean, you'd have to do the math, if Ms. Laumark would have been elected in that race or not. You didn't do the math on it, did you?
No,
How
I was
much-
just showing that the top 2 that got in the primary who won in the general.
Right, the ones that are like highlighted in yellow.
It also happened in 2007, and it can't be a great memory for Councilman Blair, but it happened in 2007 also, where Councilman Blair got the most votes in the primary, and actually ended up losing in the general. Thank God he's back.
There's got to be a loser in everything.
Yeah. But my question is, how much does an election cost? I mean,
That's the last slide.
Okay,
There's on the PowerPoint.
okay. Well, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of you here.
Our mail-in elections are about 80 to 100,000 per election.
And then if you have a publicity pamphlet, you have to add another 15,000 for that.
Those are only required, though, for
Sure.
initiatives and
Yes,
referenda, though.
if there's, any props.
So, part of this discussion came out of the last election. There was a lot of confusion about who won on primary night, who didn't win. Councilman Good wanted to see some potential changes. So this suggestion and this suggestion are, again, consistent with state law that for non-charters, and probably half the charter cities do it this way as well. Our ballot counting, I don't think anybody else does ballot counting. We looked around, and so ours is, we're sort of alone in the wilderness on that. I'm not sure why, and it's since 1976. So,
Councilwoman Scholl.
So currently the way we have it with ballot counting,
Yes.
there is no advantage to undervoting, correct?
If by ballot counting, it actually creates the potential for more runoffs
Okay,
by undervotes.
gotcha. Okay.
So I think my impression is that the feeling amongst council is that by ballot counting, enforcing runoffs, there are exceptions to the rule, but as a rule, if there's a runoff, generally and particularly this last election, the runoff results are ultimately the same as the primary. And even though in this last election, we still would have had to have a runoff election for mayor, the cost is the same. If there's one race or four races, the ballot is the ballot, the postage is the postage. So, but in some events, it may lead us not to need runoff elections if we count this way. Particularly if you have the 2 times number, the 6 council, the 2 mayor. In that case, the primaries deem the general, and the top vote getters are the winners.
Just from a community standpoint, I think it's nice to not have, in this last election, it was just, I know the community was exhausted after 9 months of campaigning and nothing changed. So I think it would be nice to have the opportunity to not have to always go to a runoff.
Councilman Good?
Yeah, I agree. I think the electorate in general finds this process quite confusing. It does cost the city substantial cost. When you look at the history here, it only really impacted a couple of races over the last 20-some years, and it probably cost the city well over $1 million in actual costs to conduct those runoffs, in addition to the cost for the candidates who have to continue to campaign, continue to spend money, and then fight for a final result that ends up being the same as it was in the primary. So I think overall it helps with the transparency, better understanding for the voters, and you end up with pretty much the same results, so you save some money in the process. I think there's a lot of positives to this.
And I think ultimately a vote is a vote. So a vote counts in this proposed method. Undervoting, a vote's a vote. It's one vote if you vote for one candidate. Under our current process, a vote almost is equivalent of 3 in terms of none of the above, essentially. And that's I think what creates sometimes the roadblock is a lot of people undervote. And by the way, the confusion doesn't stop at the public. It confuses your clerk and your lawyer too. It's very complicated figuring this stuff out on election night.
Councilman Slishka.
Thank you, Mayor. So, John, the undervote, that basically would be one-shotting somebody. Okay. And so that would negate the effect of one-shotting somebody.
The single shot vote, the undervote, what that tends to do in our current system is push to have a runoff. So if it's an undervote of 1 or 2 versus 3, those get counted as 1 or 2 towards the total. So you really actually, I think under this proposal, what you're really doing is counting more accurately the votes rather than the ballot, which is which could be, it could be a 0. They could vote for mayor and not for council. They could write in someone. So it gets very complicated as to what's a legal or what's a valid ballot, what's not a valid ballot. And so this clarifies all that stuff.
Thank you.
So from my understanding, it increases the power of one-shotting because then it lowers the threshold of how many votes you have to get as a candidate, correct?
I suppose you could look at it that way, but what it does is it makes a vote a vote. So 1 vote, 2 votes, 3 votes on a ballot, those count as 1 each. So if I had to sort of predict, I would predict that it would reduce the potential for runoffs. But still, a vote becomes a vote, whether it's 1, 2, or 3. Now, a 4 vote, if you vote for 4, it's an overvote, and the whole thing is essentially thrown out because we can't determine the intent of the voter that way. So that gets removed, and that happens, believe it or not.
Mayor Pro Tem?
Yes, I would agree with counting the vote and not the ballot.
Okay.
Did you have something, Michael?
No, I just think, as you think of it, the ballot number is always going to be higher than the vote number, so the pool is larger in terms of ballot. So the bar to get over to get 50% plus one with a vote is going to be lower and easier than that. I think that's kind of the crux of the difference between the two.
Okay. Next slide 23 is different than what we've proposed to you in your packet. The only thing we're suggesting is striking section B3 for Mayor Pro Tem. This is page 33, section 3. The reason to strike 3 is that there is no $500 threshold exemption anymore. They've taken it out of state law. Until you spend $1,000 currently, until a candidate spends $1,000 currently, they don't have to file any kind of statement of organization. So this just doesn't really make any sense under the current processes. The other two sections we're suggesting to just leave in place, which in your packet they're shown as strike through, but we've sort of resolved that issue to leave those in place.
But John, I have an issue on the question.
Yes.
I'm not sure I'm on the right one. Are you on the one with regard to the city clerk and petitions?
Yeah, it's titled page 33, section 3, continued. B, the city clerk shall perform the following ministerial duties. What you have, I think, in your packet strikes through the whole thing. What we're suggesting is only striking through Bravo 3 and leaving the rest of it in place.
Okay, so I still have a question.
Okay.
Because I know when I was running, and you need to make sure that everybody that signs your packet lives in the city of Prescott, and a lot of people think they live in the city of Prescott when they don't. So I know that the clerk did go through and make sure that the folks that are not in the city of Prescott were taken off the petition. The other question I have is that who is checking that they are registered voters? I mean, we need to make sure when candidates turn in their petitions that those petitions are valid. And as a voter, I need to make sure whoever goes on the ballot is a valid candidate. And if nobody's checking about registration, I mean, I checked as a candidate, we checked every signature, but I don't know that other candidates do. So whose responsibility is it to make sure that the signatures on the petition are registered voters? Do we require that as a city, that they're registered voters in the city of Prescott?
Well, let me address the first question with regard to B2. We're suggesting to leave that as is. So that B2 language removes signatures of those signers on petitions who list an address outside of the city. That's the current language. This page shows what the current charter language is. So B3 is suggested to be removed because it doesn't really apply anymore. As far as checking on only a qualified elector in the city of Prescott is considered a legitimate signature on a petition for a council or mayor race. That's something that really isn't under the law. It shouldn't be the function of the city clerk. It really is up to either other electors or other candidates to vet through a competing candidate's petitions to see if they have the proper number or the minimum number of qualified electors on their petitions.
So are we requiring them, or is it state law that requires them to be?
Both. In other words, a valid signature is for a city race is a person who is a qualified elector in the city of Prescott, meaning they're a registered voter who lives in the incorporated boundaries of the city. The clerk.
It seems to me if the city is requiring that we should assure our citizens that we're checking that.
Well, again, the state law and the case law really doesn't provide that the clerk, the city clerk or the city should do that. And in fact, there are cases that say that the city's not allowed to do that, that it really is up to the other electors to do those checks. So the competing campaigns or any other elector has the opportunity to challenge signature petitions of someone they believe may not have an adequate number of signatures. And that's sort of what the law says is the proper or appropriate method for checking whether people are, whether a signer is a qualified elector for a particular election.
It just seems to me that then would allow voter fraud as far as people being on a ballot that really did not qualify because no one checked. And in order to check them, then I basically would have to say to my opponent, I need to look at your petitions and make sure everybody on your petition is a valid voter. Is that what you're saying?
Well, no. Process-wise, remember, when you submit your petitions to the clerk, they become available for review by the public.
Right.
And any elector or any campaign can vet those signatures to determine whether that potential candidate has sufficient number of qualified electors who signed the petition. And if they by their analysis or calculations determine that potential candidate doesn't have the sufficient number of qualified electors, the process is they file a lawsuit in the county court or the superior court across the street and make that argument to a judge, and the other candidate essentially defends themselves or not. And again, sort of as a practice, that's why people get 130 to 150% of signatures. If someone's at 102%, then it probably makes sense for competing candidates to check. But if they're 130, 140%, maybe it doesn't. But that really should be the other campaigns or the qualified electors, and it's really not a city clerk function, because the clerk is supposed to be ministerial and neutral and shouldn't take positions against. In fact, there are cases where the clerk has tried to throw out a candidate's petitions, even though they had the number over, based on that analysis, and of course it said the clerk doesn't have that authority. So even if the clerk performed that function, I'm not sure the clerk has the authority to reject the ballot or reject those petitions. Sorry, and it would have to be someone else who files a lawsuit.
Councilman Lamerson.
Thank you. Thank you for your line of questioning there, Billy. Been down this road before. As Councilman Blair would remember, we had people from Goodyear signing petitions for people to get on the ballot here in Prescott, Arizona. We had somebody that lived out in the hinterlands in Yavapai County someplace that wanted to sit as our mayor. And you know, there's nothing more sacred to the voters than the ballot. That's our ballot. And I think that we as a community owe it to the voters in the city of Prescott and the taxpayers in the city of Prescott that the people that are sitting up here making decisions over their opportunities to make a living in the city and earn an income in the city and raise their children in the city and all the other things you do in a city, live in the city, not from someplace else. So I really appreciate your thought processes on this. And one of the reasons we went down this path before is that because you had people not from within the city trying to control the election process in the city of Prescott, whether it be from Yavapai County or whether it be down in Maricopa County or someplace else, we had them all the way from Goodyear. So I'm just sharing it with you that I think that there is some accountability of one of our agents, whether it be the city clerk or the city attorney, et cetera, to be able to give this council advice as to whether or not we're conducting a sanctioned election. And if we're not conducting a sanctioned election, we shouldn't be doing it.
Well, let me just say that the B1 mandates that the clerk determine that a candidate is a qualified elector of the city, meaning a registered voter, who lives in the city and has lived in the city for at least 1 year prior to the primary. So the candidate side of it is addressed here and under the current charter, and that's taken care of. To the extent that the clerk does the B2 function, which is remove signatures of those signers on petitions who list an address outside the city, the clerk goes through the petitions and will strike through. If on its face, the person has a Goodyear address or a Prescott Valley address, the clerk will strike through those and remove those from the signature petitions. In the same way the clerk would strike through one that had a printed name but not a signature, or a P.O. box in lieu of a street address. Those would get struck through, and then those are counted up. So that function on its face is what B2 requires the clerk to do, and that's perfectly fine.
Thank you for that explanation, John, because that was the intent of including that in the charter to begin with.
Right. The question about checking whether they're registered to vote is really outside of the authority of the clerk to do, because the clerk has no authority to then remove the person off the ballot on her own accord. Because the clerk...
Well, I can tell you, John, when we checked signatures for registered voters, we found people that had signed my petitions that were not registered, but they thought they were registered.
Understood.
And so we took them off. And so I guess I'm just saying that I think it is the responsibility of the city, whether it's the city clerk or it's somebody else, that when we say that petition, those names are valid, they're not only valid because they live in the city of Prescott, they're valid because they're registered voters, because that's what we require.
But, with all due respect, I don't agree with that, and here's why. The clerk is not acting independently as an individual. The clerk would be acting on behalf of the city. So the problem with that is it's the city, the government entity, vetting through a candidate's petitions, and then the city suing to remove that person from the ballot, because the clerk has no independent authority to remove some from the ballot if they don't have enough signatures, except if on its face they don't meet the minimum standard. So that's the challenge. So really it comes down to the other electors, the other campaigns, or any other elector in the city to do that analysis and to file that challenge to remove the person. And that's the process that's currently under our charter. So going kind of back to this section, the only thing we're proposing to remove is something that can't apply anymore, because there is no $500 threshold exemption, and statements of organization need only be filed once $1,000 is either collected or spent. So it gets a little squirrely, because sometimes there are signatures that may predate the statement of organization if that $1,000 threshold isn't met. And that's a function of, unfortunately, the legislature doing something and creating these unintended consequences.
Well, I guess I'd just like to say, I wish there were some way that we could assure our citizens that the names that are on the petitions are in fact qualified registered voters and they live in the city of Prescott. I think we're doing half of that job, but we're not doing the other half. So I don't want to beat a dead horse. I just want to let I checked mine. I'm sure I hope all voters check theirs, but we don't know that.
Councilwoman Scholl.
John, so let's say the clerk did begin to check voter registration status, could that be considered influencing an election? If the clerk were to then remove a candidate from the ballot?
Maybe, but it's the clerk has the authority to reject a petition if on its face it doesn't meet the minimum number, whether it's an initiative, a referendum, or for a candidate. Mm-hmm. The clerk doesn't have any other legal authority to go beyond that, to do the research, to compare the signatures to the voter rolls, to make that determination. Nor does the county clerk in a county election or a statewide election. That is really a function of the electors, the other people, the other campaigns, or any individual to do that analysis. That's why there is a 10-day period between the deadline for turning in petitions and someone filing a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And you do see that in other communities. If the petition numbers are relatively close to the minimum, the other campaigns will swoop in on it and they'll get people and they'll go through it. And if the number's below the minimum, or if they determine the number's below the minimum, they go to court and it's up to a judge to throw it out. So that's the checks and balances, I think, of the system.
I agree with that. I think as a candidate in this last election, I was closely watching how many signatures everyone else was turning in. And, serious candidates are going to take the time to get that 130, 140% of the signatures they need, knowing that there is going to be some drop off. So I think there is a system of checks and balances, and I know that candidates are closely watching other candidates during elections.
Councilman Blair?
I can see both sides to that, but, I saw in 2010 the other side of it, to where a candidate or a sitting council person filed a petition with the court to question signatures on somebody's pages. And I'm not sure that's, I would disagree. I don't think that's my responsibility to put up the financial burden to question whether that person has the right signatures or whether they're out of the state. What I had to do, and I'm sure a lot of people did, I know Jim did, I hired a private person to take mine and check the signatures at Yavapai County voter registration to make sure they were legitimate. But I'm not even so sure I should have done that. I think there's something that says about a municipal election that there's somebody that works for the clerk's office that does check those to make sure they're legitimate. I know there's a cost both ways, but to file a lawsuit with the court for the candidate or somebody else is running against another candidate to do that, it causes some real animosity between the different people that are running that might be your very neighbor. And I don't know that that's the right thing either. Or who may be very well sitting up here. I could have filed a lawsuit to question Alexa's numbers, and then all of a sudden if they were okay and mine were okay, I got to work with her. I'm not sure that's righteous.
Could we hire like an outside third party to check the signatures?
The problem is, even if you did the work, in whatever method or manner, I don't think the clerk has the authority to remove the person without going to court. So then you have the clerk, as the city, filing a lawsuit against a candidate or a campaign to try to remove that person from the ballot, because the law provides that if on its face those petitions meet the minimum number, and again, that would strike out the Goodyear signatures, the ones that don't have signatures, the Prescott Valley, addresses, the ones that don't have a street address, those are struck out, as are ones that aren't properly notarized or properly dealt with on the back. And then the clerk's function is to count the number of valid signatures on the face of the document and make a determination whether they meet the minimum. To go beyond the face of the document, the clerk wouldn't have the unilateral authority to throw the person off the ballot or remove them from the ballot without a court order. So, to take some Councilman Blair's, the clerk would be suing a candidate who may end up being the clerk's boss, down the road, or one of seven. So it's you talk about a little bit uncomfortable. But at the same time, the case law out there says the clerk doesn't have that authority to do that. So that's the challenge, really, is that the law doesn't allow the clerk to unilaterally remove somebody from ballot, other than if the ballot is invalid on the petitions are invalid on their face. So the normal process, the typical or standard process is that other campaigns or other electors in the community do the analysis and check, and if they believe that the person doesn't have the minimum number, then they go to court and they challenge it. So it doesn't have to be, it's not limited to a campaign, don't get me wrong. Any elector in the city could make that challenge.
I have a follow-up.
So John, one last time I have a question here. If the clerk has the authority to take a name off of a petition because they don't live in the city, why doesn't the clerk have the authority to take a name off because they're not a registered voter?
Because the law allows for the clerk to look at the face of the document to determine whether the signatures are valid, but to go beyond that is beyond the scope of what the clerk's authority is.
Councilwoman Scholl.
So when when you're collecting signatures, you are not an official candidate. You are working to become a candidate, correct? So when do you officially become on the ballot?
When you're certified by the clerk's office that you have the minimum number of valid signatures.
And when does that 10-day period start?
It starts at the end of the turn-in date. So last year was May 30, I think. So there's a 10-day period where somebody can review the petitions, do whatever the analysis they determine to do, and then file a challenge in the Superior Court.
Okay, so anyone who turns in their petitions early is certified by the clerk as a candidate. That could happen before that 10-day period starts.
I think the 10-day period starts at the end of the turn-in period. Not if somebody decides to turn in early, they're giving more than 10 days to do the review, is my view.
So could we change when people officially become candidates to?
I think the state statute on election challenges allows for 10 days starting at the close of the deadline. So it's the end of May generally for an August primary. And mind you that the time frames are very, very tight in terms of, the county publishes or prints our ballots and all that. It's very tight. So, and that's why courts are required to prioritize an election challenge above everything else other than a capital murder case.
Okay, my thought process was this: if we don't officially proclaim people as candidates until that 10-day period closes, if someone challenged another person's petitions, would they technically be removing someone from the ballot?
They're preventing them from getting on the ballot if the challenge is successful.
Which would go through the same court process?
That's what they would be doing. In other words, once the 10-day period runs, then then all of those candidates that have at that point on their face a minimum number of signatures become candidates for the ballot. So I guess I may have misused the term "remove from the ballot." It's basically prohibit or preventing them from being on the ballot.
Gotcha.
Councilman Good?
Well, I support Councilman Orr's concerns. We can probably compare our city clerk with the Secretary of State in the sense that they're trying to make sure the election process is accurate and above board and correct. This is a nonpartisan race. So even though some of us candidates are members of political parties and have access to the county's database to check correct signatures and registration status, et cetera, sometimes non-party members wouldn't have that equal access, even though they could go directly to the Board of Supervisors election office to do the same thing. But it seems to me if our city clerk doesn't have the authority to take additional action once it's clear that a candidate has submitted inaccurate signatures, at least if they don't have the authority to take action themselves, they could notify the candidates in that race that one of the candidates has not met the standard. And that way the other candidates could choose to challenge that candidate's signatures in court. And this could be handled like a normal business inventory, where you do cycle counts at random and come up with a number of randomized checks, and sometimes you can project the overall accuracy of that inventory based upon those numbers. And that way you wouldn't have to necessarily check every single signature, but if you did a random selection of, let's say, 100 signatures and you found 20 of them to be inaccurate, then your assumption is maybe 20% of these submitted signatures are inaccurate. And if they submitted 110% of the required number, you get a problem.
Let me just address the first point. Is the case that I was referring to is actually a Secretary of State case. I forget the name, versus when I think Frohmeyer was Secretary of State, where the Secretary of State attempted to remove someone or prevent someone from getting on the ballot by doing precisely that type of checking. And the court said that's beyond the scope of the Secretary of State. And if you sort of read the election law, it says, you know, in a statewide election, Secretary of State, and local election, it's the clerk. So really the same function. So we're extrapolating that case to the clerk. The other issue is, I believe the county does a sampling. They don't do it here?
Not sure.
Okay. It would really be up to the county to do that sort of random sampling, random checking. Because it's a city election, they don't do it here. But it would really, we'd have to see if the county would be willing to do that, and that would be to compare the signatures every 10th signature to make that determination whether they're a registered voter as against the voter rolls. And some I know Maricopa County does that for elections, where they'll do a random sampling of a referendum, for instance, to see if there is a meets the minimum. And I think the standard is if they're more than 2 or 3% above the minimum, they're fine based on the random. If they're 3% above the minimum or below, then they actually do the full-blown analysis. So that's something we would have to talk to the county about, whether they'd be willing to do that or not. But that would be really a county election function.
They would charge us for that.
Certainly. Yeah, it would be a cost. So we could certainly talk to the county, see if they're willing to do that random sampling. But you know, it's depending on what the cost would be.
Mr. Lamar?
I was just sitting here thinking through this, and it was just a thought and a suggestion. I think there's some nuance with this. I think whether it's the clerk or somebody else in city government that has a responsibility for counting and cross-checking, you can stop at that point after you've counted and cross-checked and not make a determination about elimination. Or, in other words, if I have a list of 130 and I check them and 120 of them are registered voters, I just present that finding to the public, at which point the public, which includes every elector in this community, could then take the next step to do what they want with that information. You following what I'm saying? I think counting tick marks is different than eliminating or making a determination. Do you follow my logic? I think it's a different animal.
Councilman Lamberson.
Thank you, Mayor. Michael, thank you for being adept at this. You understand that the council has some concerns. We need to move through this and in some manner protect the sanctity of the election process in Prescott. If it hadn't been for the lack of a better word, fraudulent attempts in the past, we wouldn't have that concern. But we do have concern.
And let me just, I think you should, before you go there, I think it should be noted that we check with the county to see if they're willing to do that check. And the reason why, as a candidate, I wouldn't be opposed to that, and then you could pay for that check, each candidate, with his campaign funds to make sure that they were legitimate.
Well,
then there wouldn't be a question.
If the city were to contract for it, it would just come out of the city's general fund. I don't know if, if a campaign or elector is going to do that, they would probably be better off just doing a wholesale, signature by signature analysis. So the random checking is a possibility. Some county election offices do it. Apparently, Yavapai County doesn't, at least for us.
John, this is Billy. If the county can do it, I don't know why we couldn't do it with contract employees if we wanted to.
Well, again, even if we did it, it wouldn't allow the clerk to remove someone or prevent someone from going on the ballot. And again, and let me
We're not removing someone from the ballot. We're just saying this petition is possibly not valid. They're never on the ballot.
Let me sort of back away from this a little bit, by the way. This is not in the charter at all. So if you want to sort of put that in the charter, that's something that'd be an add to the charter or a change to the charter. I don't know if it would be legal to do, depending on what you propose. But currently, that's not a charter mandate on the clerk And I would pose to you that it's beyond the scope of authority of what a clerk can do.
Checking on who's registered. Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
You think it's beyond?
Well, I guess I
somebody
would
count?
propose that we check that out and look at it and think about it so that we can make sure, like Councilman Lamerson said, that the petitions that we're presenting are all valid before we put somebody on the ballot. I mean, I just think that's our responsibility as a city.
Can we maybe follow up with Michael's
I think it
idea
is.
and explore the legality of?
And I would tell you that I with all due respect to the mayor pro tem, I don't agree that it's the government's job to check the validity of registered voters. It's really the electors' job, the qualified electors in the other campaigns, because I mean, think about the potential ramifications that the city government is sort of attempting to put a bar on somebody running for election or for local government. It seems that there's kind of an inherent conflict in that.
Well, then maybe, I mean, why do we require them to be registered voters?
Well, we're not.
That's the law.
What I'm talking about is the specific digging down into whether someone's a registered voter in the city. It's the clerk's function clearly is to look at the face of the document, but going beyond that is the standard is that other electors or other campaigns do that analysis and file those challenges. That's the way that's the way it's done everywhere else. So cities, the question is do you want a ministerial officer of a government, and I don't say that in a pejorative, I mean a ministerial officer of the government to file lawsuits to remove somebody from a ballot?
Councilman Good?
Well, it seems to me the question comes down to where the city clerk's authority ends and where the candidate's responsibility begins. And I'm sure that we are not the first city to ever discuss this issue. So I think it would be appropriate to investigate this and get a clear understanding of what the authority is and how far it can be done, and then we can bring it back and discuss it at additional time.
Happy to.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think we've exhausted this particular topic. Did you have anything else on your slides here, Mr. Palladini?
A couple brief things. And this is sort of for information purposes, not much unless you want to discuss it. This new consolidated elections bill has been signed, and it provides that even charter cities, again, there's some potential challenges, have to go to a consolidated election, which is even numbered years in the fall for local elections. If the turnout on the local level is less than 75% of the turnout in the same jurisdiction for a race in which a governor is elected. So our turnout is pretty consistently around 60%. That means that if in a governor's race, the local turnout would have to be almost 80% or more for this consolidated election law to affect us at all. And I assume there's little to no interest in conceding the point and moving to a consolidated election. Okay. This is just a consistency with what we talked about before, changing ballots to votes. This is just existing language. Did we have any reason this is up here, Maureen, other than show existing language?
Just I think that they already had the discussion about the general and the primary and how many people move over.
Okay, so last slide this goes to a couple of points. It's sort of counterintuitive. If we went to a consolidated election, which I think is a moot point, it would actually cost us more by piggybacking onto county ballots because mail-in elections are actually less expensive than on-the-ground elections, about twice the price, give or take. And this may be premature, that, timing-wise, if you wanted to send charter amendments to the voters, understand that if we did a special election, which I don't think we're going to meet the November 28 election timeframe, it would cost us $4.60 per ballot. If we did a special election in March, it would cost us about a little less than half, a little more than half, $2.50 a ballot. If we did it at the next general election, or I'm sorry, our next regular city election, August 2019, it would be free or no additional cost other than the publicity pamphlet. But it would go along with, none of the changes would be effective for that. In other words, the way we count votes wouldn't be effective for that election. So it's something to think about. I suspect that we're going to probably have to come back for further study session discussions. So this may or may not be something you want to discuss today. That's my last slide.
Questions or comments? All right.
All right.
I would say we've got a few minutes for public comment. Based on some of the conversation here, it seems like another subsequent study session would make sense. I think this council understands the gravity of changing the charter, particularly on some of these major points. I think what you're hearing is fiscal responsibility, clarity, integrity, and most importantly, we want to make sure we uphold the public trust. So when you're talking about, particularly when we talked about the salary issue, I don't think we want to touch that based on the recent election. So with that said, do you have some comment cards?
I do. Ralph Hess.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Several times it's been mentioned, and all of you know that effectively this has to be referred, charter amendments have to be referred to the voters. My suggestion is, if it already has not been created, to set up a committee, maybe an ad hoc committee or a standing committee similar to what you do with the general plan, because the general plan also has to be go to the voters, so that prior to submitting the proposed amendments, you have citizen participation in a committee to make suggestions as to additional possible amendments or deletions. So if that isn't already in place, listening to what's gone on today, I think that might be a good idea to have such a committee. Listening to the comments related to the mayoral term, the suggestions I have is, one, perhaps consider amending the charter provision that requires 2 council members to put an agenda item on, since the mayor can put an agenda item on the agenda. Also, maybe allow 1 council member who, all of you get a single vote, be able to put an agenda item on instead of requiring 2. And the other thing is to consider reducing the term for council people to 2 years. Referring those to the voters to make that determination, since they're the ones who, or we are the ones who eventually make that decision. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one more card. Judith Merrill.
Thank you. At some period between our last year's primary and our last year's general election, the Courier presented a column in which it recommended something called rank choice voting. And when I read about that, it sounds like a very logical way to eliminate a general election and all the money that that costs. So do you know what that is? I don't really, but I could tell you what I think it says in this article if you want to know.
Go ahead.
It says that people vote for a certain number of candidates, and they vote first choice, third choice, say. And so if somebody's first choice is eliminated because they have so few other first choices, then that voter's second choice gets counted. And I'd have to really figure this. I see you're rolling your eyes, and I rolled mine too. But I think it's something that you should consider, and I would like you to investigate this and consider it, especially when you're considering how to handle elections. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Sandra Smith?
Good afternoon, Mayor, Council. This is just a suggestion that might work in terms of the vote count or the validation on the balloting. If each candidate or each potential candidate would take and check his list against the voter registration and validate and say, you know, I've checked these people, they're all registered to vote, and was held accountable for that, then nobody else is involved. Nobody there, you know, he's not attacking his neighbor. He's not attacking somebody that may be on the council with him. He's just saying, this is what my count is and what my signatures are. Would that work? Could that be done legally? John?
Yeah. Any other comments that you have, or?
No, just that.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Any other
No, Mayor.
public comment? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Palladini, for that. And we will take a break and be back at 3 o'clock. This meeting's adjourned.
When I ever
Hanging
did
on
it,
the line, or
did
we?
that louder than
Billy, are you still there?
Jack.